Okay. Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everyone. Isabelle, please do the introduction.
Okay, so warm greetings to everyone. It's a real pleasure to introduce Tashi Tsering, who's a lecturer at the Department of General Education at Mount Royal University in Calgary. And Calgary is home to about 800 Tibetans, and we don't really hear much about those Tibetans or this community. So I'm really excited, and it's the second largest community of Tibetans after Toronto in Canada. So Tashi Tsering is what I would like to call a pioneer in Tibetan studies, especially by Tibetans, a pioneer in what I would say the critical sociology approach, looking at social inequality among current Tibetan-speaking communities, especially as they relate to environmental and climate change issues. Now, more and more scholars are looking at environmental questions, especially through the lens of political ecology, but he has been working in this field for over 2 decades. So he earned his PhD in 2014 from UBC at the Department of Resource Management and Environmental Studies with a thesis entitled Social Inequality and Resource Management, Gender, Caste, and Class in the Rural Himalayas, for which he did extensive fieldwork in Spiti. And actually, he was one of the very first persons to reply to our call for speakers in this series. And very enthusiastically, he offered to talk about 3 very different topics. And he says, please choose what you would like to hear. And all of them were, I think, related to his fieldwork in Spiti. So one of them was, how do inequalities get normalized? Hugely interesting topic. The second one was Shit Matters, Yak Dong and Sustainability in the Himalayas. Again, very interesting. And a third one was The Secret of Agricultural Sustainability in one of the world's most climate sensitive and remote places. But actually, he will speak today about a completely different topic, so a 4th topic, water resources and hydropower development in Tibet. So we really need to have him again to speak about one of the previous topics in the next series. I hope so. So actually, during his MA degree, he also developed an expertise in water management, especially about the politics of dams on Tibet's rivers, an expertise that he has carried out until now. He has advised numerous organizations about this topic, and his publications include not only academic articles, but also articles in major newspapers, such as the New York Times, The Guardian, and the Hindustan Times. Dam construction on Tibetan rivers is very topical, as you are all aware of the spectacular protests last month in Kham, in Wimpotu, near Derge, against the construction of a dam that would lead to the destruction of old monasteries, one with murals dating back to the 13th century, and the eviction of several villages. So having in mind, through his talk today, the overall context of dam projects in Tibet will be very helpful. So I will just mention more that Tashi Tsering is also the founding editor of Chingiponya, Tibet's Environment and Development Digest, and he's also the author of 2 environmental crimes of universal jurisdiction listed in the 2015 Madrid-Buenos Aires Principles of Universal Jurisdiction. So without further ado, the screen is yours. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Isabelle. Tsering?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, Isabelle, for the very kind introduction. I was delightfully surprised to hear so many things I didn't expect you would know and share here. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for tolerating my enthusiasm in this speaker series and for allowing me to change this topic at the last minute. As you know, this topic is inspired by the recent Kamderge dam protests, and as you briefly mentioned, I hope that this lecture will provide some context, some broader context and clarification on water-related issues, the importance of water-related issues, and specifically around dam construction. So without further ado, I will begin my presentation, which will require me to share my screen. I hope this will work smoothly. This way. Okay, I hope you can see my screen. Yes.
We can see it, but could you please choose the screening
Full
mode?
screen mode?
Yeah.
Yes. There we go.
Yes, it's
Oops.
fine. Thank you.
This is the final slide. I should start with the beginning slide. There we go. Okay. The title for my talk is A Brief Survey of Discourses on Water Resources and Hydropower Development in Tibet. And as I started working on it, I realized it is actually a really broad topic, and it turned out quite unwieldy. And I have tried, and I will continue to try to be as specific, succinct, and finish this lecture within 45 minutes or so. For a brief outline, I will first mention the purpose of my lecture. I can do that right now. What I aim to do is essentially explain how water-related issues and discourses have shaped Tibetan society, culture, and politics from the earliest known history to the current times. And in doing so, I'd like to provide highlight some pressing issues that face contemporary Tibetans in Tibet, and are some issues of concern about the future of Tibet, and share some insights as to what could be useful in order to deal with this situation. Then for those who may not be aware or informed about discourse and discourse analysis, I will provide a brief explanation, a non-specialist explanation. And then I will provide some examples on discourses on Tibet's natural endowments, how these are not something ordinary, but actually extremely valuable and important to the Tibetans. And then I will briefly talk about some important examples of discourses on water in Tibet from the historical past. And then I will focus a substantive amount of time on modern water discourses, specifically on three examples: the idea of Asia's water tower, Tibet as Asia's water tower, and then the idea of Tibet as the third pole, and then the idea of Tibet as China's water tower. And then I will end the lecture with a brief closing statement. Oops. Oops. Pardon me. Okay. Well, discourse, very simply put, as a word, it means written or spoken communication or debate for a noun, and as a verb is to speak and write authoritatively about a topic. Examples include sustainability. The discourse of sustainability has been quite big for the last few decades. In more recent times, since the COVID, especially during the COVID, we had the discourse of social distancing. And for the Tibetans, particularly Tibetans in Tibet, the discourse of Lagya are extremely important. I like to think that we are like little finding Nemos swimming in discourses. You know, in that movie, Walt Disney movie, the little clownfish, Nemo, is trying to find his home and is being, you know, dragged and pulled by different ocean currents in one direction or the other. And these powerful currents are like the different powerful discourses that we find ourselves swept by, like the discourse of social distancing or sustainability. And what is interesting about these discourses is that when we engage in these discourses seriously, they really transform us and our relationship, our mentalities. And so in this lecture, I'd like to provide examples and discuss how and illustrate how discourses are historically and socially specific practices of meaning and knowledge making or production. And that these practices systematically form the objects of which we speak about. In other words, the discourses that we engage in are material in effect. And they tend to serve specific interests and purposes that are often not visible or unknown, so to speak, or hidden, because discourses are effects of power. And these power, how should I say, restricts or provides the criteria, the limits and the boundaries for these discussions. And needless to mention, there are many discourses and they are often in competition, whether directly or indirectly, as I will provide some examples. And there are also hierarchies of discourses. Some are more powerful than the others, which ultimately results in certain discourses becoming the most powerful or hegemonic. So, I don't know. Okay, so let me provide some examples of discourses on Tibet and Tibetans. I want to remove this box that I see myself. I can close this, good. All right. One example that comes to mind is Hwatsegel's more recent article in the American Ethnological Society Journal, where he compares the description of Tibet as explained or as, propagated by the Chinese government, which tends to show Tibet as an empty wasteland, compared to how a Tibetan herder sees their land as bountiful, with many resources and animals and full of life. And Hwatse Gyal's article is a very good example of the competing narrative, how there is a dominant narrative about Tibet as a wasteland within the Chinese media or Chinese government publications, and how it is how should I say, critiqued and challenged by the Tibetan nomads. Another very good example is whether Tibet is the contemporary Tibet today is a hell on earth or a heaven on earth, depending on who the speaker represents between Dharamsala and Beijing. And we often hear these competing discourses. Another very good example is, we see extreme depictions of Tibetans as a backward, uncivilized people. Or oftentimes you also see Tibetans portrayed as wise Buddhist practitioners in popular media, video games, and things like that. And the final example is whether Tibetans are a peaceful, non-violent people, or can they also be warriors and freedom fighters? Carol McGranahan's book, Arrested History, on histories on the CIA's involvement and the Tibetan resistance movement against China is a very good illustration of these competing discourses, how there are these different narratives. One of, Tibetans as a peaceful, nonviolent people became the dominant narrative in the more recent history, which led to the arrest of the histories of the freedom fighters, as McGranahan argues eloquently in her book. So these are just some examples in general. Now I want to focus on discourses on Tibet's natural endowments. And this image, kind of leads us into that kind of narrative. And among the different narratives, so many narratives out there, we should go to perhaps what is most important, this Tibetan text 1 to A6, this Dunhuan text from the 8th and 9th century, which includes a poem in association with the description of how the first king of Tibet, Nyati Temple, descended from the heavens on earth and how he was enthroned. And in this very important, one of the most ancient extant documents that we have, it includes a narrative about the Tibet's natural endowments in Tibetan land as such. It says, Namkini, U, Sayini, Kil, Kangini, Rawa, Chukungi Ko, Rito, Satsang, Yusang, and it goes on. It means the center of heaven, this heart of the world, fenced around by snow mountains, the headland of all rivers, where the mountains are high and the land is pure. Now we have to bear in mind that this text was composed during the imperial, the early Tibetan Empire, and these actually are extremely important, not just as historical documents, but as texts that were composed to create this Tibetan national narrative. As scholars of Tibet, we know how the idea of the pan-Tibetan identity became solidified precisely during this time, from this time. And this poem, these few lines, it might seem quite ordinary, but it is anything but ordinary for the Tibetan people, as I will provide some contemporary examples. Bear in mind, these were written over a millennia ago, but what about contemporary or modern Tibetans? Here is a prayer, long life prayer, written for His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama by his two tutors. Ling Rinpoche and Tijang Rinpoche wrote this prayer. Kangri rawe korwe shingam der, pendang dewa malu chungwe ne, jirin siwa tingzi yatsoyi, shabe site bhardu tengyurchi. This prayer is commonly recited by Tibetans in their ritual prayers regularly, throughout the world. One of the most common prayers. It says, for this realm, encircled by snow-covered mountains, you are the source of every benefit and bliss without exception. Tenzin Gyatso, the powerful Chenresi, may you remain steadfast until samsara's end. So here we have the elite of the elite Tibetan lamas drawing inspiration from this poem, this narrative, directly or indirectly, in composing the most sincere prayers for their beloved and most important Lama. And it is not just the Lamas or the Buddhist masters, but ordinary Tibetans. These ideas are very common in songs, so many songs. There are just literally countless number of songs that refer to Tibet in these words. Here is an example of one of the more recent songs that became popular. It's called Semki Lope, Mentally Return. The song became really popular, and some of the singers include Yadong, Gunga Kangshu, and Tewa. The song was composed by Druk Lagye, and the song goes, "Hangar Humbul Hai Jagri, Tangchap Ngomon Yinde Changzui Tiyin, Sadan Yangbo Karme Mende Yi, Namge Tongsu Chabe Nechoti, Zamli Yangje Kangjo Chumote, Nye Kangje Pebe Pasayins." Its snow-capped mountains are the heavenly ramparts. Its pure blue rivers are the shimmering ornaments of the sun and the moon. Its vast meadows and pastures are the beds of the stars, the holy land situated close to the zenith of the sky, this bountiful land on the roof of the world. These are our fatherland, the land of snows. Again, as mentioned earlier, discourses need to be understood within specific social and historical context. And for Tibetans inside Tibet, as you know, Tibetans cannot speak overtly about political issues and politics. And as such, referring to these home and these ideas of Tibetans as the people of the land of snow is a rhetorical device for uniting the Tibetan people as one. And it is no surprise that such references are common in Tibetan songs, particularly those coming from Tibet. Here are some examples of books written by Tibetan writers and scholars who have chosen to use the term the land of snows instead of Tibet. And I'm pretty sure that these scholars and writers, when they chose this word, it has this expression has a very strong resonance for them, as is particularly in the context of love and pride in one's nation, as we say, Lagya. Here are two examples of blogs, online blogs, that has drawn inspiration from directly from that ancient poem. One is directly called High Peaks, Pure Earth, which I think is the best blog on Tibet. And so, which provides commentaries and translations of works by Tibetans in Tibetan, English, and Chinese languages. So I think it's one of the best sources of information about Tibet. And the other is a blog that yours truly I created when I was a PhD student. It's called the Tibetan Plateau blog. But notice how there is in the banner, it's written over here, Neki ni u, sai ni kil, linki ni ningo, kangi ni rawa, chukungi ko, which is directly quoting from that ancient poem. And when I made this banner and wrote this, of course, I didn't know I was going to do this talk and would be reflecting one day on the significance of this poem on the Tibetan people. I was simply inspired. The point I'm trying to make over here is that those lines, that ancient text, Dunhuan text, might seem ordinary to people, including to scholars, but it is actually nothing ordinary about it. It is extremely powerful, livid with life and emotions for the Tibetan people, and it continues to resonate powerfully to all peoples, Tibetan people. And it has served, here's the point, notice if we think about when the original text was written, and we can safely assume the intention of the writer and the people who generated that discourse or came up with the is essentially to promote the sense of Tibetans as one people, as one nation. And guess what? These examples that I provided beautifully, I hope, powerfully illustrates how this has really been effective in accomplishing its intended goals of uniting the Tibetan people. And in fact, it has become one of the most powerful tools and methods, I should say, of uniting, feeling a sense of oneness among the Tibetan people today. Next, I will focus on water. And we don't have time, so I'll have to be brief and talk about some of the most important examples. Perhaps the most ancient and important ideas about water that has implications on Tibetan culture and society is the idea of water as abodes of serpent spirits, Lu. Lunesa, nagas or serpent spirits. I'm not going to talk much, but suffice to say here that it has shaped Tibetan society in powerful ways, specifically, for example, in terms of instituting practices, customs, laws related to water management. And also these have a very peculiar gendered dimension to these ideas of water as abodes of serpent spirits. For example, most of the lakes in Tibet are feminine in name, and most of the mountains, comparatively, are masculine. The abodes of gods. The mountains are the abode of gods, and the water bodies are the abode of serpent spirits. And it is customary, very common in Tibetan society, for the women to be propitiators and protectors of the serpent spirits, Luthor and things like that, and how it is customary for the men to do the hasu in the invocation and the propitiation of gods. One example comes to mind, the place where I did my fieldwork in Spiti Valley in the Western Himalayas. You may have noticed how women in this part of the world have this very unique and, how should I say, striking headgear that they wear, which is called pera, which goes over the head and comes down, and which has they put so many turquoise as decorations. And pera is how should I say, an ornament of cultural identity and pride for the people in that part of the Himalayas. And it is something that women wear during their weddings, for example, and on special occasions. And there's a specific symbol to that, because that part of the Tibetan plateau is extremely arid, dry and arid. And for these people, especially farmers living in this part of the arid Western Himalayas, water is extremely precious. And for them, the main source of waters are the springs. And it is extremely important for them to protect and propitiate and conserve and have very complex rituals and practices and customs to conserve water and to manage water in these springs. And much of these are done by women, and which is why they wear these headdress called pera, which is clearly a serpentine in imagery. And it's not just women's role, but also the lamas, known and famous, popular in that part of the region. For example, the Lotsawa Rinchen Sangbo, even the contemporary reincarnation of Lotsa Rinchen Sangbo, he continues to have a close relationship and rituals and practices going around in these parts of the world and in doing rituals to bring rain, for example. Next is how the Yalung River, the Yalung Tsangpo, has shaped Tibetan culture. Just like the Nile is important to the Egyptian society, or the Yellow River is important to the Chinese civilization, the Yalung River or the Brahmaputra River, Yalung Tsangpo, is important to the Tibetan civilization. And there are so many things to talk about. I will just briefly mention how, for example, throughout the Yalung River, particularly in the south, it is filled with places of religious sites, pilgrimage sites, hidden valleys and caves, Bayul, as we call them, right, which are extremely important and coveted places of worship and pilgrimage for the Tibetan people. Another example comes to mind about Simokangel, the supine demoness, right during the early stages of the development of the Tibetan nation and the Tibetan Empire. We have the narrative about how the Tibetan king or the emperor Songtsen Gampo had difficulties bringing Buddhism into Tibet because the Tibetan land and the civilization is wild like a demoness, and how they had to perform all these rituals and different things to suppress, pin down the demoness, right? And in doing, and we can see in the artist's depiction of the supine demoness, how the Brahmaputra River, the Yalung River, flows, through the spine of the demoness. It's essentially, it goes right through the center of Tibetan, nation and the civilization. And like, we have stories we know from, scholarships from, Egypt to China, how the management of those rivers from the earliest times played a really important time for the development and integration of the nations. And so is the same for the Tibetan case. Per Sorensen has written about this very topic in his essay, Hasa Delivium, where he talks about how flood control in Lhasa was done for the political hegemony. In fact, he suggests that the history of Lhasa, which is the capital city of Tibet, is essentially the history of water management for flood control in that region. And then, needless to mention, especially we have the esteemed expertise of Isabel over here about Tangtong Gyabo, the famous iron bridge builder, who has again played a very important role in shaping Tibetan culture and also in Tibetan, religious practices, cultural religious practices, integrating Tibetan art and dance with religious practices. And Tangtong Gyalpo has played a very special role. But what makes him curious is that he is also credited for having built so many dams. Some say 108 dams, or some, whatever be the number, the construction of many iron chain bridges across the many, many rivers across all over Tibet suggests that, human, how should I say, endeavors and accomplishments, the Tibetan accomplishments in succeeding, so to speak, the challenges of imposed by nature, and in particular how Tangtong Gyalpo's not only material accomplishments, but also his miraculous powers that is associated with is extremely important to the Tibetan people. And finally, in terms of the more recent history, there is the narrative about modernization initiatives of the 13th Dalai Lama, how the Tibetans were not backward people before the Chinese came, but in fact, there is a narrative discourse about how Tibetans were modern, comparatively speaking, during that time period, compared to much of the world at that time. And the Tibetan leaders were actively promoting, engaging in modernization initiatives. And one of the important examples in that discourse is about how the first hydroelectric dam was built in Tibet during that time by Ringang, Changoba Rinzin Dorje, as his name is apparently, and many Tibetan scholars like Jayanobu, Tsering Shakya, and Kirtundov have written about this. So these are some examples that illustrates how discourses related to water have shaped Tibetan culture and history from the earliest times to contemporary. And so within contemporary discourses, now I want to focus on these three: Asia's water tower, the third pole, and China's water tower. And then I will quickly wrap up this lecture. Asia's water tower, I think for critical scholars in general, it is a good practice to question, in whose interest of, it's question of these discourses and policies. It's always a good practice to question in whose interest. And it's interesting that, first of all, this narrative that, Tibet is the source of major rivers is nothing new. As we have seen, it has existed since the dawn of Tibetan nation, right? Over a millennia ago, it was very well known and has been propagated. But in particular, in the modern context, Tony Huber traces the genesis of this kind of narrative in the idea of what he calls green Tibetans that came particularly in the 80s, 1980s. How the idea over here is that the exiled Tibetans, particularly exiled Tibetan leaders, generated this new discourse in the 80s, particularly from mid-80s, essentially presenting the Tibetan culture and the Tibetan people from the perspective or from this idea of this Rousseauian ideas of noble savage, how people were in tune and respectful of nature, and they were natural protectors of nature, and they did not engage in activities that harmed nature, and they were living in harmony with nature. But the critical point Tony Huber was suggesting is that this romanticism is not just, or this essentialism is not just romantic essentialism, but strategic essentialism that exiled Tibetan leaders had chosen to portray Tibetans in this way within specific historical time period that is to fit within the broader global environmental zeitgeist of those times, particularly thinking about how the Tibetan so-called freedom movement became highly mobilized during that time in the context of the negotiations or the dialogues between the exiled Tibetan leadership and the Chinese government. And the so-called, His Holiness the Dalai Lama so-called reaching out or internationalization of the Tibet issue, as the Chinese would call it, or the Tibetan leadership reaching out to the Western countries for support. And as such, Tibetans were using this discourse for international media attention and to generate political allies, so to speak, to demonstrate their relevance, broader relevance to discourses and livelihood issues, broader global issues in general. Here are a couple of photos I chose to illustrate how these have become rather effective, because here is an example from Nepali Times, showing how the Tibetan Plateau is the Asia's water tower. And there are countless, so many examples, not just from Nepal, but Thailand, Vietnam, and all over South and Southeast Asian countries now know about the significance of the Tibetan Plateau. So it's this narrative is not only known among Tibetans, but actually now it is quite widely known. And here's another photo of the Guardian illustrating how the Chinese corporate interests are, looking into tapping Tibet's glaciers for selling premium drinking water. And attached to this is, to generate concern among downstream downstream countries about the importance of these and in particular concerns about China's building all these dams, and these news clips clearly show about how China is here to walk for the water grab, and China is controlling the water taps of Asia's rivers, and this kind of discourse is now widely known and circulated in international media. Here again, what I'm illustrating is how discourses are, they tend to have material effects on people. They are not just discourses, and in particular, how this exiled Tibetan leaders using this discourse have been remarkably effective in achieving their goals. Next, I'm going to move to the idea of Tibet as the third pole. This idea is interesting because it is actually quite old. It was first coined by a German mountaineer, Marcel Kurz, in 1933 to refer to Mount Everest. Here's the specific sentence in which he refers to the point third pole. Thanks to Google AI translation, it says man will have no peace until he has reached the third pole of the globe. Here, the interesting point here is that the genesis, the origin of this idea, is less to do with Tibet as having so much water or ice and glaciers or climate change, but actually has more to do with the interests of these mountaineers, adventurous mountaineers who are there to conquer these, remote and difficult to reach places, right? And this sentence, and in fact that whole article, which is available freely online, clearly illustrates that the origin I was actually referring to Mount Everest, and from the interest of mountaineers. Fast forward a few years, few decades, and we find this concept of third pole adopted by climate scientists and environmentalists. And here is a photo from the Nature Journal. This is a magazine of the Nature Journal, where Tibet is presented as the third pole. And as the caption says, climate change is coming fast and furious to the Tibetan Plateau. The idea here is that the Tibetan Plateau has the largest collection of solid water outside of the North and the South poles. And climate change has increased the rate of melting of these glaciers, and hence drawing attention to not only the North and the South poles melting, but also the Tibetan Plateau. Again, if you think critically in terms of the different hidden interests and biases in these narratives, you see we cannot deny that, as scholars and scientists, we also have our own biases and interests. And the biases of climate science became quite obvious, particularly during this, if you remember, there was this, in a few years ago, there was this climate gate where some scientists' emails discussing the portrayal of their research findings were leaked. And these biases became more obvious, and particularly in this context, because during a few years after that, one of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC reports, actually mentioned how if the current rate of melting continues, the Himalayan glaciers will disappear by 2035. Essentially, about 10 years from now, all the Himalayan glaciers will disappear. Now, this became highly controversial because, as we found out, this was not based on scientific studies, but rather a speculative comment made by an Indian glaciologist that was inserted into the prestigious IPCC report, which again illustrates the biases of the climate scientists. But needless to mention, such kind of narratives is highly useful and interesting and useful to Tibetans in general and Tibetan environmental activists in particular, as well as to researchers interested in environmental and water resource issues in Asia. Here are a couple of examples of organizations today that are inspired by the idea of the third pole. One is called Tibet Third Pole, which is a Tibetan activist group that are focused on Tibetan environmental issues. They are called Tibet Third Pole. And the other is simply called the Third Pole, which is one of the best news analysis and media outlets, analysis and commentaries on Asia's water resource issues. That is published out of England, I believe. And the point I'm trying to suggest over here is that the narrative of the third pole, again, has spread quite widely and has inspired many people. Finally, the discourse of Water Tower of China. This is an interesting discourse because as I was doing my master's research, this discourse started showing up on the internet. In particular, there was this constant reference to how much water there is on the Tibetan plateau. There are 1,500 lakes there. Its water reserve is equal to the annual runoff of 75 yellow rivers. And this discourse is not, again, we should not see of these as benign, but actually it resonates powerfully with its intended audiences. Because these are published in Chinese media, and for the Chinese people, Yellow River is extremely important. As I mentioned, it is the cradle of their civilization. And in particular, when this discourse came out, and powerfully, as I will explain, in the beginning of 2000, year 2000, late 1990s is the context, and year 2000 is when this discourse really became widely used. And again, we have to better understand, these discourses can be better understood within their social and historical context. And at that time, what was interesting was that the Chinese government had openly acknowledged that environmental problems or issues or challenges in general, water pollution and scarcity in particular, is a extremely serious threat to the legitimacy of the rule of the Communist Party. I remember in graduate schools and reading commentaries from China scholars suggesting how remarkable such acknowledgement is at that time. And hence in China at that time there was this discourse within China about needing to do something about environmental issues and water issues in general. And then they were looking at Tibet as the water tower. So needless to say the water resources of Tibet as China's water tower, you can clearly see this as a part of the broader discourse of China's Tibet. But it's not just that simple. In fact, it is more unique and important than that. As I mentioned, it was during that time the Chinese government acknowledged the problems with water. And this discourse was particularly promoted in association with government's initiatives for the protection of, environmental protection on the Tibetan Plateau. It coincides with China deciding to establish so many nature reserve parks on the Tibetan Plateau in particular, the establishment of Sanjiangyuan, Three Rivers Nature Reserve, protecting the sources of the Yangtze, Yellow, and the Mekong rivers, Dichu, Machu, and Zachu rivers. They established this huge swath of land right in the middle of the Tibetan Plateau for the protection of the headwaters of these rivers. And the government is, pumping out media to the media saying, demonstrating its many different initiatives it's undertaking to deal with water challenges. But are there any unknown interests that we should be concerned about or we should be thinking about? I suggest there is. If you were given a huge map of the world and put on the wall of your office, and there's a huge map of the world, and you're given a box full of thumbtacks, these thumb pins, and you're told that there are about 4,500 or 44,000 thumbtack pins in this box. Your job or your task is to put these pins on the world map, on precise locations where there are large dams in the world. And you are told that there are about 44,000 large dams in the world. What will happen is that you will end up having to put more than half of these pins in China. China has more than 22,000 large dams, and most of these are concentrated in the eastern and northern China. And figure this out because China only had 22 large dams when People's Republic of China was established. So what this means is that China experienced an explosive trend of building big dams. And this trend has created a powerful and extremely large and powerful, what I call water industrial complex that favors the implementation of large-scale infrastructure projects. And it was in my master's study, when I was doing my research on my master's thesis, I was actually genuinely interested in understanding why China was building so many dams. When large dams are being decommissioned at a higher rate than being constructed in Western countries. And I conducted extensive research and I found how there are these striking patterns of similarities between what is called America's military industrial complex and what was happening in China's dam construction. And we don't have the time to go into detail, but really the specific details, the structural similarities, the structure of interest in the political economy of decision making in China, for example, are just mind-bogglingly striking. Strikingly similar to the phenomena of America's military-industrial complex, which, needless to mention, is a systematically studied concept in political science, and I did my master's in political science at that time. So we know that China has built so many dams, and so today, however, there are hardly any river left or any tidal spaces left for the construction of large dams in China. But if you are a student of bureaucracy, a critical student of bureaucracy, you know that you would want, such bureaucracies would always want more dams and would always look over and steamroll over the local protests and concerns downstream, but you're only interested in the construction of more and more dams. But there's no place in China. Therefore, what is left is China's water tower, or Tibet, which today has become the most active and promising site for China's dam builders. And this is really the bigger context within which we have to understand the recent protest in Daegu. Here, unfortunately, there is a lack of data and facts on dams in Tibet. There's a lot of discourse and a lot of political rhetoric, especially from activists and leaders. There's a lot of rhetoric, but there is really a lack of facts, knowledge about facts. So when I was doing my PhD, I realized this point, that there is a lack of data, and I worked with a colleague and collected information on 114 dams on the Tibetan Plateau. And this is one of the maps that was published on the Tibetan Plateau blog. Here, for example, published in 2013, more than 10 years ago, I have identified Kangpo or Kampo near Daegu as one of the dams that was being prepared for construction. And if only the Tibetan leaders or the people in Tibet had paid attention to the information, they would be more informed. In fact, on my blog, there is specific information about precise location, who are the funders, and what is the state, and many other information, including several databases. And here, a very important thing we need to realize is that although China's dam building industry would only focus on building big dams, they cannot build big dams in Tibet right away. They have to build in a scaffolding manner. They have to first build smaller dams on the high plateau, and then they have to build medium-sized dams, which is what they are working on with regards to Kangpo. It's not one of the big dams as they would want to build. There will be even larger dams that will be built. Over here at that time, I am showing the headwaters in a shaded in this yellow or golden color as areas under preliminary analysis. In fact, these were the regions that were being actively studied for the purposes of building big dams in the headwaters of Dichu. Again, bear in mind that this is precisely the region where they have built the Three Rivers headwaters. And again, bear in mind that in order to promote this place, this initiative as a conservation project, thousands of Tibetan nomads have been forcefully removed from their traditional livelihoods and places they live, and forcefully made to live in these settlements. right? And so here we have a contradiction. On the one hand, there is this rhetoric or discourse about nature reserve parks and protecting uh, China's or Asia or China's water tower. But at the same time, they are building so many big dams. And here you have to also understand this in a very specific project, and that is for some reason outside of the radar of most analysts. And when I was actively researching, I've always been actively focusing on this project. But in recent times, I've been involved in other research topics and teaching here at Mount Royal University. And for some reason, this project is being overlooked by people and want to pay attention over here. So the South to North Water Diversion Project is the biggest and the most complex water diversion project ever conceived and, in the history of the world, not just China, but in the world. And within this project, the most complex within this project and the challenging aspect of the project is so-called Western Route, as you can see on this map, that is being planned precisely in the headwaters of the Dichu and Machu or Yangtze and Yellow rivers, precisely near Kamkampo region. And this is where they want to build a series of dams, including some of the tallest dams in the world, connected through a series of tunnels dug through a mountain range. And this project was conceived a long time ago, decades ago, and has been under the radar, but it is also coming up gently, as you can see in this more recent map published by the Ministry of Water Resources in China. And as recent as last September, I think, there was one article that talked about how the central government planning agency dedicated to this project have reached a new consensus to go ahead with the Western Route. September 2013, the main office of the South North Water Diversion Project says that they have decided their so-called preliminary consensus. And this is a preliminary consensus because there was some friction, there were some criticisms to the project, particularly coming from downstream Chinese engineers and academics, particularly in Sichuan province. Academics and research in that province were concerned when they first heard about it. They were surprised and shocked that no one actually knows about it. And then they started writing, they in fact wrote a report and then which generated some discussion within the Chinese leadership and which again led to, how should I say, quietening of discourse. But now, as I'm saying, again, just last September, the main office have decided to, they say they have reached preliminary consensus, which means, and the timing is curious because that's exactly after that is when we hear about the Kamdige Kamto dam, right? The decision by the government to issue these notices for these people to move away from their ancestral lands and villages to make way for the construction of dams. I'm not saying that a dam Kamto is one that will be directly used, but I pretty much confident that this will be a part of the project. And there are others that are actually bigger than that. Further downstream near Batang and Tapa, they are constructing two dams close to each other that would be bigger and more serious in terms of the a number of people that will be forced to move away. So isn't that interesting or, incongruous, to say the least, with the narrative about environmental conservation and the construction of these? And needless to mention, the victims or the people who are in the losing end of these discourses and practices are the local Tibetans. I'm just going to close here with some final closing statement. So what I have tried to present is that, by examining, I should say, we have examined how discourses on water have shaped Tibetan society and politics in important ways from the earliest history to the current times. As effects of power, these discourses often carry hidden political intentions that become normalized over time through repetition. Whether it is poetic verses about the people of the land of snows as a unifying idea for the Tibetan people, or water as the abode of Lu, serpent spirits, to institute water management customs, these ideas have effectively shaped Tibetan culture, society, and politics towards their intended purposes. The modern discourses about Tibet's water, however, are different. Their logic and intentions go beyond the scope of the Tibetan people. While exiled Tibetan leaders have efficiently used the discourse on Tibet as Asia's water tower to gain international media attention and political allies, they seem ill-equipped to deal with the discourse on Tibet as China's water tower. This challenge is particularly daunting given the fact that Tibet's hydropower development trends and the hidden interests of China's water industrial complex are unknown to most people, especially Chinese citizens and leaders. If this trend continues, Tibet will soon become home to hundreds of new big dams and many large water diversion projects. This analysis suggests that a good way to deal with the challenge might be to raise awareness among Chinese citizens and leaders. This, however, requires effective advocates who can focus on the common Tibetan and Chinese interests in jointly protecting the ecological integrity of their rivers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tashi Tsering.
Could you please stop sharing your screen so that we could
Oh,
see
yes,
you?
I can do that. I don't know how to do that. Stop share. There we go.
Thank you so much for this broad presentation of so many different things. I really enjoyed it, and you did engage with discourse a lot, like so many concepts that you covered. So thank you so much. I see a comment from Isabel. Okay, it's not related to the talk. And if anybody wants to initiate the discussion, I would gladly give the floor to this person. Otherwise, I would start with some of the questions that I have. Okay, so I don't see any hands at this moment. So my question would be, first question, you mentioned that during the modernization initiatives of the 13th Dalai Lama, there was the first dam constructed in Tibet. And I think you also said that those initiatives were supported by the, I don't know, by some, at least by some of the elite. So what kind of discourse what kind of discourse could you ascribe to that moment of Tibetan history? Was there any opposition to the dam building, because it was something very revolutionary happening? And how this first dam construction is reflected on at this moment?
Yes. Well, the broader discourse within which this initiative is discussed, at least by the Tibetan scholars like Jamyanobu, Tsering and Ketundup, are essentially the broader discourse of Tibetan modernization under the initiatives led by the 13th Dalai Lama. And of the many different initiatives, one of which is where the 13th Dalai Lama sent a group of young boys to England to study, so-called the rugby boys. And after their studies, one of them, Ringha, considered to be one of the brightest among them, was charged with, in fact, sent again to study, to draw up plans, and specifically for the construction of the dam. I do not know about any opposition to this project in particular. However, I do remember reading, and these are much of what I share today are from memory, from studies and readings from many years ago. So I remember somewhere where there was opposition to the mining initiatives that was done during this time, because Tibetans, as you probably know, are highly skeptical, or traditional Tibetan society has been very, how should I say, in opposition to mining initiatives in general, particularly with the idea of these many of the mountains being the abode of gods, so to speak, lane, lari, so to speak, and at the same time, yeah. And so that's the only thing I remember from that time.
Okay, thank you. So could you think of like when this negative awareness of the dam construction has started building in Tibet? Like, what was the turning point?
Oh, it started actually quite early. One of the most controversial, first major controversial Chinese dams in Tibet was the Yamdrokso Dam. And this was highly controversial because at that time, for example, the International Tibet movement was quite vibrant and active. And this project was particularly a hot topic or a focus of the Tibet activist groups, and hence, at least in the international media, it was talked about a lot. It was also controversial within Tibet and within the Chinese bureaucracies and the dam building industry, because they had some structural issues and mechanical issues that the Chinese leadership weren't too proud of, in terms of not being able to, build a well-functioning dam, right? And but nevertheless, the project was, pushed ahead, and in fact presented. Now I don't remember clearly, some kind of a birthday gift of some sort, as a gift, essentially a gift from the Chinese state to the Tibetans. I don't remember, don't quote me on this, I don't remember clearly, but something along, there was this discourse, at least over, at that time. And I also remember how this was went ahead, especially in connection to the death, after the death of the Panchen Rinpoche. And so that would be one of the major turning points in the history of modern Tibet, particularly in relation to the construction of dam projects. Yeah, and what I am finding it particularly striking, as I try to suggest over here, is that, you know, there is this glorious environmental rhetoric, benign initiatives to conserve China's waterhead. And bear in mind that these discourses are meant for the Chinese audience. They are not meant, or, you know, the international audience is secondary. The primary focus of this discourse is the Chinese people, the Chinese nation themselves, where water is a huge problem, serious problem, and hence the initiatives to protect or conserve these conservation initiatives are how should I say, highlighted very powerfully and vigorously in the media. But at the same time, you know, there is this hidden interests of the state and which I call China's water industrial complex, or we can simply call it the economic interests of the dam building industry, which, as I provided with those data, you know, it is incomparable. You know, in terms of the world's dam building trends, China is far ahead. The second in number, third, fourth, you know, combined together is small compared to just one country in China. And unfortunately, although I should mention, in the early 2000s, especially after the Chinese government acknowledged, you know, drew up enough courage, so to speak, to acknowledge the environmental challenges as serious and having the need to do something about China's environmental challenges, there was a loosening of, how should I say, political organization, and there was a mushrooming of establishment of environmental NGOs within China. In the early 2000s, there were so many anti-dam movements within China, and the government allowed people to form environmental NGOs, which is really within the broader context of how this Chinese state has come to the understanding that environmental conservation is something they are ill-equipped to be effective, because of its contradictory role in promoting economic development and being focused on economic development as the main, how should I say, the legitimizing agenda for the Communist Party. And hence they have to remain focused, the bureaucracies and the administration has to remain focused on economic development, and how that is contradictory to environmental conservation. And hence the government's acknowledgement and allowing people to organize at the grassroots level, so to speak, to come up with initiatives to protect the environment. And as such, there was, you know, a lot of these kinds of things going on in China. And things have become, although, you know, these groups still exist, many of these groups still exist, but the energy, the vibrancy of those environmental movements was quite strong in the first decade of the 21st century, I should say.
Thank you so much. I have more questions, but I would like to give the floor to Nicola.
Thank you very much. Very interesting and thought-provoking. Half of my question is already answered actually by now. I wonder how do you think will the government react? Because there might be a lot of activists and lobbying for the nature, but all these other dams you mentioned, yeah, 22,000 dams were already built, and technology invented for that. I saw, for example, this documentary on this south to north water now, where the water has, where the rivers have been rebedded in other areas, and the villagers' complaints were not heard of. How do you imagine will this be can be changed in future, actually?
That's a good question. Thank you. Well, it is a daunting challenge for all of China. And as I suggested in my final remarks, I think the best way to do this is to develop awareness within the Chinese people and leadership. I think that the Chinese people are not thinking in most Chinese leaders and people are not thinking in terms of the broader challenge that they have, like the recognition about this mammoth complex that have essentially hijacked China's water management policy in favor of large-scale control projects. The Chinese government is incapable of, it seems, and now I should be more humble, it seems it is incapable of, adopting alternative approaches, but to, favor the use of big-scale water control projects, and this is really because of the political economy of decision making on these projects, how it's done, and the structure of interests that shape this. Just like in America's what they call the Iron Triangle, the military-related businesses, the military-related bureaucracies, and the key decision makers, how they form what they call Iron Triangle. Something very similar is going on in China's water industry, construction industry. The top leaders have been dominated by engineers, by their professional background. They come from bureaucracies and they are linked to, directly or indirectly through their family, very often to these power companies, energy banks, and power companies. And hence there is this ideological, economic, and bureaucratic interests that are aligned with each other. And these people, they have a revolving door kind of system within which these people go from one bureaucracy or one position to another, and somehow they have hijacked China's water policy. And of course, the ordinary Chinese people may not have interest in looking at these challenges from such theoretical or academic perspectives, but I am pretty confident that if and when they know, for example, that the western route of China's south to north water diversion project, what is actually going on and what does it mean in terms of the future ecological integrity of their headwaters or their water tower, affecting two of their most important rivers. Yangtze is economically the most important river in China, and needless to mention, the Yellow River is, central to their culture and civilization. And the plans are to mess up essentially the headwaters of these two rivers. And it is very much like, robbing Jack to pay Paul's kind of scheme without asking the people. And of course, in between, the Tibetans would be forcefully removed, and all the monasteries will be, so many monasteries will be submerged, and it would cause so much destruction. And as I mentioned, there are these plans to build so many series of big dams. And if and when the Chinese people become aware of these challenges, I am quite confident that they will raise issues, because water is a very serious challenge, and we know there people, once you you understand the bigger challenges that you have, especially those affecting the water, people will say something and that's the only way I think we can change this. And unfortunately, the approaches used by environmentalists, advocates, and activists are not focusing on this, but on alternative approaches like protests in front of consulates and things like that, which I only think might be counterproductive. You know, and hence I am very concerned, and that is why I chose to talk about this, so as to suggest that everybody, Tibetan leaders, international supporters, academics, Chinese citizens, Chinese leaders, you know, have to be more serious about this, and actually focus on raising awareness among people that actually matters, because none of this is in the hands of the Tibetans or the Tibetan supporters. Everything is in the hands of the Chinese people and their leaders, and hence the Chinese people and their leaders need to know what is at stake. Because if we let the China's dam building industry to go ahead with its, you know, economic and bureaucratic and ideological interests, it will be disastrous, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Isabel, your turn, please.
Yes, first I'd like to say how much I really enjoyed, I think, your talk. I think it's a very important, topical way of framing what's happening in Tibet that I personally hadn't thought before. I really enjoyed the way you have woven together Tibetological stuff at the beginning of your talk. And I was wondering, how is he going to come to the contemporary issues in Kham and other places? And through this lens of discourse, it's really wonderful how you tied them together. So my question ties in with what you just talked about, raising awareness among the, let's say, general Chinese population or government. Two related questions about that. First, how about Chinese science or scientists?
Yes.
During the pandemic, there was, well, I discovered that there was actually a lot of dialogue between biologists in China and outside of China. They were exchanging DNA sequencing of the virus, and you know, there was actually more dialogue than one would have expected. So here, where are these water engineers, or I don't know exactly what's the title for them, where are they trained? Is there absolutely no exchange of views between their practice in China and maybe a training, or I don't know, their colleagues outside? Especially since, I believe, but you correct me if I'm wrong, the 2008 earthquake in Sichuan has been related to the construction of the Three Gorges Dam. And so the weight of the water weighing heavily on seismic, I don't know, a line, seismic line, yeah? So building so many dams in a very fragile seismic region is bound to provoke even more problems. So where is Chinese science? They must have compiled data and thought, you know, is it suppressed by bureaucracy at that point?
Thank you.
Would you?
Thank you. Thank you, Isabel. I really like your question. I like the way you think. Well, the answer is, well, first, as I said, you know, it's a very good question, because it was precisely Chinese engineers living downstream in Sichuan province that were the first group of people to raise concerns about the western route of the South to North Water Diversion Project. And these concerns, I believe, were raised around the middle of the first decade of the 20th century, maybe around 2005, not sure, but around that time. So what happened was a group of engineers led by some retired engineers of Chinese Academy of Scientists and another association of engineers, I forget their precise names, they first learned about the project and they were curious. They were asking the precise questions that you were wondering about, and they actually apparently did research on these issues, and they were just shocked what they found out. And one of the most striking things that they found out was the lack of awareness among not only
Tashi, could you, yes.
Okay, I have unmuted. I don't know where I got muted. Well, I was just saying how the, well, please tell me, how many minutes was it that I was on mute?
Just
Short
one,
while? Okay, okay. So it was in the group of Chinese engineers that got interested in the topic, looked into the matter, and they found out, for example, that people had very little to no idea at all about the project. And here we are talking about academics and leaders in Sichuan province, the elites, and they had no idea. And one of the leaders, engineers who led the initiative in publishing a collection of essays on the project, he even went around and did interviews among government officials in Sichuan province, and he has written how even the government officials didn't know anything about the water diversion project. And as such, this is a very important point, right? About why I was saying we need to work on raising awareness among Chinese people, because here are the most relevant people, Sichuan province, directly downstream, people who will have to pay for these. And here are the government leaders and the elites, the engineers, and who are completely surprised and have no idea about what was going on. It was precisely because of their publication that it generated some discussion at the higher levels, appropriate higher levels, that led to a kind of, lull about this project. And as I am saying that, but there was never a cancellation of the project. And in fact, more recent, blurbs of news, if I only wish we had, I see Robbie Barnett here, Kate Saunders here, we had, news outlets, the Tibet Information Network that monitors what is going on, because only in just last September, the main office of this project, has come out saying that they have reached a preliminary agreement to go ahead with this. So what is happening is they are doing it very gently and in ways that will only be a surprise, and it's already in place. And the preliminary studies, the environmental impact studies and the feasibility studies has been going on, and their reports have been published online in Chinese language publications for decades openly. But what is interesting is that most of these studies are led by the Yellow River Conservation Commission, essentially a government bureaucracy that is biased in favor of the project because they are supposed to be the recipients of the water. But I see it more from a bureaucratic interest because, as bureaucrats, you want more projects, and And much of these initiatives are led by the Yellow River Water Conservation Commission, and rather, how should I say, discreetly, I don't know if that is the right word, but essentially not without much propaganda behind it, but actually going ahead by led by them rather than the Yangtze River Water Commission. You see, and again, it's a contradiction of water management within the Chinese government and the problem of compartmentalization of natural resource management bureaucracies in general and river management commissions in particular. And so we have such a problem there. But again, coming back to Isabel's point, the short answer is most Chinese engineers don't know about this. This is very clearly illustrated by these incidents, as I mentioned, among the Chinese engineers in the Sichuan province. And this fact itself, it suggests that, they might be one of the first and perhaps the most important allies or supporters or audience for raising this awareness, right? And so there, I'm going to stop.
Thank you so much. That is a very detailed reply, I think. I have a question from Columbia University, from Gengxiu Galai, who asks, are you aware of the Hunxi River project area, which involves diverting rivers from Tibet to Xinjiang? Then the second question is, how do South Asian countries react to such a proposal? Or how do South Asian countries react on China dam projects in upper streams of their rivers in general?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, the specific water diversion project, I think I may have seen in a passing, but I don't know about this project in any detail. But I will mention here that, there are so many proposals and ideas about water development, including big dams and water diversion projects. Because, people propose, there are bureaucratic interests and there are academics who are coming up. And so there are many proposals, and we should, I don't know how serious that project is. It could be very serious in the sense that there may be serious government support or interest behind this project. So that is something we should look into. I would say that. And as far as the downstream countries, unfortunately, these concerns are, how should I say, they don't have much teeth. Their downstream countries have raised voices. I have, full disclosure, being active in the use and the propagation of the discourse of Asia's water tower, and I've been actively involved in this at some points in my life in the past. And so I know how, and I have worked and collaborated with downstream environmental leaders, as well as try to speak with government officials and things like that. And their interests are not quite strong and substantive. And also, even if it were, these were become strong, we have to be mindful of the realpolitik differences between the power differences between the different countries. And in addition to the fact that China is also the headwaters, so as to, they don't have anything to lose in the debate. And as such, currently as it is in terms of international interest, the international concerns, downstream concerns over these projects are quite mild, and needs to be more, needs to be stronger and more, it seems very conspiratorial notorious of me, but needs to be orchestrated more carefully, so to speak. If one were to work at a broader international campaign so as to bring pressure, because there is almost no pressure at all, and downstream concerns are very much in paper, so to speak. Yeah, unfortunately.
Thank you.
I would suggest the most important downstream concern comes from India, actually. India is the exception because of India's own dam building prowess, so to speak, interest, so to speak. And then India, depending on, many of its important rivers being sourced in Tibet. And as such, India is an exception, and there is quite a lot of interest, political as well as academic interest on this topic. And the rhetoric of concerns over building dams in China or in Tibet, sorry, and concerns by the Indian media as well as academics and politicians are quite strong, but they go through fits. Sometimes it becomes particularly strong depending on what the political environment is within India. But there is a strong interest, and yeah, so India is an exception, and it's an important one. I'll say that.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify. You said that there were 114 dams on the Tibetan plateau, but I think you said that it was a while ago, or it is still the same number.
The 114 dams, that's not exact. 118 are dams, information on dams that I and my colleague collected and published or shared on my blog. What that means, and these are not just built, but includes planned, those under consideration for, proposals are there, the government is actively considering building. So these are 118 that we were able to find information on, including precise geographical coordinates and who the power companies are that are funding these and things like that, that were published on my blog. What this means is that there are far more numbers that are actually being built and planned. Those are simply those that we were able to find. And this is not a funded project. It was just a side project that I was involved in, right? Two volunteers doing work. And as such, if one were to seriously look into this, the number of these, there would be far more, especially now since then to now, there would be even more numbers, right? And that is why it is safe to suggest that there are literally hundreds of dams that are being built and planned on the Tibetan plateau. It is safe to assume that, because over 100 is something that have been documented, and the databases are shared publicly on my blog.
Yeah, because if you compare the overall number of 22,000 dams in China versus 100, okay, over 100 in Tibet, in terms of territory, like Tibet is a very large piece of territory. It is still just around 1% of the overall dam project building in China. And
this is precisely the concern, right? This is precisely the concern, because it is now the active and a new site, and the most active site for this huge bureaucracy and this huge economic interest that wants to build more and more. It needs to keep on building and building more and more, because it has to employ so many people, right? And has such huge appetite for more money and more project. And it doesn't have any places. So it's providing its expertise to, countries outside of China. But these projects are not many, and it has this voracious appetite. And so water tower of China is the perfect one.
Yeah, and it also made me think that you said that since 2000s, there has been this movement and awareness among the general Chinese population against dam building in China. So is there a similar awareness now among the overall Han population about the dam building in Tibet? Or is it more an issue related solely to these areas or to like Tibetans represented by the exile community and so on?
Good question. Well, first of all, during those days in the early 2000s or mid, 2000s, early 2000s, as I said, the political environment was different. It was not Xi Jinping. It was, the main dynamic leader that came on media again and again was Wen Jiabao, who was more amenable to people's voices and was more progressive. And as such, there were more freedom among the people, and hence the environmental movement was quite vibrant at that time. The second part of your question, the interest of these environmentalists, specifically, let's talk about these anti-dam activists, because as you can imagine, Chinese people very often are sick of the dam project, especially among environmentalists. And those people who were actively working on different dam issues were not really interested in Tibet dams because there were hardly any dams in Tibet. And of course, there were many, but for them, it didn't matter. It was tiny and it's very few. Whereas in China, there were so many dams and so many big dams, and so many more people were directly and urgently needing help. And hence, Tibet was down on their priority list. They were aware of some of the dam projects in Tibet. The one that were the Chinese environmentalists and activists were working on that coincides with Tibetan interest was, for example, the Tiger Leaping Gorge Dam, Takchongga, in Yunnan. And that was a major big dam project that the government was actively working on. And there are ethnically Tibetan people, affected by that project, among others. And that was one of the very few, I should say, or in fact, only major project that affected or connected with the Tibetans that the Chinese activists were involved in. So long story short, the Chinese activists had just too much issues and dam projects and urgent issues they were dealing with, and Tibet was down on their priority list. And in contemporary situations, unfortunately, I don't see that much of interest. But I am quite sure that there are lots of, Chinese environmentalists who are actively working on this. I don't know of any because of my current research and, life interests are not focused on this. But I'm pretty sure that there are lots of Chinese activists who are working on these issues. Right? And if and when they come to know about what is going on in Tibet, particularly the scale of the reached on the Tibetan plateau and the implications, long-term implications for their own future livelihoods, there would be much stronger interest within the Chinese environmental groups in general and hopefully leaders in particular.
Thank you.
But the frightening and the sad reality is that I don't know of any groups who are making this kind of connection and trying to reach to the Chinese people and leaders on what is happening in Tibet. And that is the most critical thing that needs to happen, but that is not there. And if that is not there, I'm afraid it's quite serious.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question among our guests today?
By the way, isn't this presentation going like 2 hours?
Yes, but we take out.
Well, thank you
we're-
all very much to all these people who came to attend and who have patiently listened to these discussions and the presentations. I really appreciate it for your time and attention. Highly appreciate it. Thank you.
We had more guests, yeah, it's just some of the people, it's in the chat, they had to leave. So yes, you totally had a lot of a large audience, and we have very much enjoyed it. Yeah, you see, there are more comments coming up.
Thank you.
Yes, so I think we can say that we can wrap up today's lecture.
I think it is time.
Okay, we will not pressure you to stay any longer. Thank you so much, Tashi Tsering. It was really a pleasure to have you on board, to listen to your
Thank
talk, listen to your answers for these questions. And please join us for we're planning to continue the lecture series in the fall. So please consider coming up with a second lecture for us. We would be very
I will.